There's a very specific type of person who slips past every defense mechanism an avoidant has spent a lifetime perfecting. And it isn't the person who chases hardest, isn't the person who loves loudest, isn't even the person who's most conventionally desirable by any external measure. It's someone far quieter than that. Someone whose impact doesn't fully register until long after they're gone. And today I want to talk about exactly who this person is, why avoidant attachment styles struggle so specifically to forget them, and what it actually is about this particular kind of empath that manages to bypass a psychological defense system built, quite literally, to keep people at a manageable distance. To understand why this specific type of empath leaves such a lasting imprint, you first have to understand what avoidant attachment is actually protecting against, because it's rarely what people assume from the outside. Avoidant attachment isn't simply a preference for independence, and it isn't, despite how it's often framed, a lack of capacity to feel deeply. It's a learned strategy, usually formed very early in life, in response to caregiving that was inconsistent, intrusive, overwhelming, or emotionally unsafe in ways that taught a child that closeness itself was the risk factor to manage. And so, as adults, avoidants develop an extremely sophisticated internal alarm system, one that activates the moment intimacy starts to feel like it's asking something of them. Vulnerability, dependency, the surrender of control that closeness inevitably requires. Most people, without realizing it, trigger this alarm system fairly quickly because most people, understandably, want reassurance, want consistency, want emotional availability delivered on a predictable timeline. And when an avoidant senses those wants, however reasonable, however lovingly expressed, their alarm sounds and the retreat begins, often before they've even consciously decided to pull away. But there is one specific type of empath who manages to move through this exact terrain differently, and it's not because they want less than anyone else, or because they're somehow immune to needing connection themselves. It's because of a very particular combination of qualities that, together, create something an avoidance alarm system genuinely struggles to categorize as threatening. This is the empath who offers depth without demand, someone capable of extraordinary emotional attunement, capable of noticing the smallest shifts in mood, capable of holding space for real vulnerability, but who does all of this without attaching a requirement onto it, without needing it reciprocated on a fixed timeline, without treating the avoidant's natural need for space as evidence of rejection requiring immediate repair. This combination is rare, genuinely rare, because most people who are deeply empathetic also tend to crave a corresponding depth of reciprocity, and when that reciprocity doesn't arrive on schedule, they escalate. More questions, more reassurance-seeking, more visible anxiety about where things stand. The specific empath we're talking about today doesn't escalate. They notice. They feel it. But they don't turn that noticing into pressure, and this distinction changes everything about how an avoidant experiences them. I want to be really specific about why this particular quality is so disarming, because it's not simply that avoidants prefer people who leave them alone. That's actually a misreading of what's happening. Avoidants don't actually want distance for its own sake. What they want is safety from the specific fear that closeness will eventually become demand, that vulnerability will eventually become obligation, that love will eventually become something they have to perform correctly or risk losing entirely. This fear, formed so early, so deeply, rarely gets fully articulated even to themselves, but it drives almost every retreat, every sudden coldness, every inexplicable pulling away, right when things start to feel genuinely good. So when an avoidant encounters someone who offers real depth, real attunement, real emotional presence, without that presence curdling into pressure the moment the avoidant needs space, something happens that their alarm system genuinely doesn't know how to process. The threat they've spent a lifetime bracing against simply doesn't materialize. And this creates a kind of quiet, disorienting safety that most avoidants have never actually experienced before, because almost everyone else, understandably, eventually asks for more than the avoidant can offer on the timeline being asked for. The second quality that makes this specific empath so unforgettable is their unusual comfort with silence, both literal and emotional. Most people, especially those with anxious tendencies, experience silence from a partner as a problem to be solved, a gap that needs filling, an absence that requires immediate explanation or reassurance. This empath experiences silence differently. They can sit inside an avoidance quiet, inside their need to process alone, inside their occasional emotional unavailability, without treating that silence as evidence of something being wrong, without needing to fill it with questions, without needing constant confirmation that everything is still fine between them. And this matters enormously to an avoidant, because so much of their internal experience revolves around managing other people's discomfort with their natural rhythm, the rhythm of pulling close, then needing space, then returning again, a cycle most partners find confusing and threatening, a cycle this specific empath somehow instinctively understands without needing it explained. The third quality, and this one is subtle but crucial, is that this empath maintains a genuine, visible life of their own, one that doesn't collapse or reorganize entirely around the relationship the moment it begins. This might sound like a small detail, but it's actually one of the most significant factors in why an avoidant can't easily categorize this person as a threat. Avoidants, on some level, are extremely sensitive to signs that they've become someone's entire emotional world, because that kind of centrality feels less like being loved and more like being responsible for someone else's entire well-being, a weight that triggers their deepest fears about obligation and entrapment. The empath who avoidants can't forget doesn't disappear into the relationship. They maintain their friendships, their interests, their own emotional ecosystem, and this visible independence does something quietly powerful. It signals to the avoidant's nervous system that loving them will not require becoming their sole source of meaning, that there's room to breathe inside this connection that doesn't exist in relationships where the other person's entire identity seems to hinge on how the avoidant shows up that day. The fourth quality is perhaps the most psychologically significant of all, and it's this specific empath, when they do eventually need something, when they do eventually express a boundary or a need, does so with a clarity and calm that doesn't trigger the avoidant's shame response the way accusation or panic typically does. Most avoidants have an incredibly sensitive relationship with shame, specifically shame around being emotionally inadequate, being incapable of giving someone what they need, being fundamentally flawed in their capacity for closeness. When a partner expresses need through panic, through accusation, through visible distress, it activates this shame response intensely, and shame, counterintuitively, drives avoidance further away rather than closer, because shame makes the relationship feel like a test they're failing rather than a connection they're building. This particular empath expresses need differently, calmly, clearly, without catastrophizing, without making the avoidant's occasional distance into evidence of some deeper character failure. And because this expression doesn't trigger the same shame spiral, the avoidant can actually hear it, actually respond to it, in a way they typically can't when need arrives wrapped in anxiety and accusation. Here's what makes all of this so significant in explaining why avoidants struggle so specifically to forget this type of empath. Long after the relationship has ended, sometimes long after they've moved on to other relationships entirely, this person represented something the avoidant didn't know was possible until they experienced it. They represented evidence, direct, lived evidence, that closeness didn't have to mean losing themselves, that vulnerability didn't have to mean obligation, that being truly seen by someone didn't automatically translate into being controlled, managed, or slowly suffocated by someone else's needs. And once an avoidant has experienced that kind of safety, even briefly, even imperfectly, it becomes a reference point their nervous system can't fully erase, because most of their subsequent relationships, by comparison, feel like a return to the exact dynamic they've spent their whole life bracing against. I think it's important to say clearly, though, that this empath's impact on the avoidant doesn't necessarily translate into the avoidant actually staying, actually choosing the relationship, actually overriding years of ingrained defensive patterns, simply because they finally encountered someone who didn't trigger them the usual way. This is one of the most painful and confusing parts of these dynamics for the empath involved, and it deserves real, honest attention rather than being glossed over in service of a tidier story. An avoidant can genuinely recognize, even consciously articulate, that this specific person offered them something rare, something safe, something they've never quite found before or since, and still, ultimately, walk away, still retreat, still let old patterns win, not because the empath did anything wrong, but because recognizing safety and being psychologically ready to fully receive it are two entirely different thresholds, and plenty of avoidants recognize the first without ever quite crossing into the second. This is precisely why so many empaths who fit this specific profile end up carrying a particular confusing kind of grief after these relationships end, not the straightforward grief of loving someone who was cruel or dismissive, which at least comes with a clear enough villain to direct the pain toward, but a much more disorienting grief, the grief of loving someone who genuinely valued them, who genuinely experienced them as different, as safer, as rare, and who still, despite all of that, couldn't quite stay. And I want to spend real time on what that specific grief actually looks like, what it means, and why understanding the psychology behind it changes everything about how these particular empaths eventually make peace with an ending that, on the surface, seems to contradict everything they thought they knew about how deeply they were genuinely, uniquely seen. And I want to spend real time on what that specific grief actually looks like, what it means, and why understanding the psychology behind it changes everything about how these particular empaths eventually make peace with an ending that, on the surface, seems to contradict everything they thought they knew about how deeply they were genuinely, uniquely seen. The first thing to understand about this specific kind of grief is that it doesn't follow the shape most people expect grief to follow, because it isn't organized around betrayal the way grief after a cruel or dismissive relationship tends to be. There's no obvious villain to be angry at, no clear moment of mistreatment to point to and say, that's where it went wrong. Instead, this grief is organized around a much stranger, more disorienting question. How can someone value you this genuinely, this specifically, and still choose absence over you? And because there's no satisfying answer to that question, at least not one the heart accepts easily, this particular grief tends to loop, replaying the relationship over and over, searching for the moment where things could have gone differently, searching for some action the empath could have taken that might have finally been enough to override whatever kept the avoidant from staying. I want to say something important here, clearly, because this looping search for the missing action is almost always fruitless and almost always self-punishing. There often wasn't a different action available. The avoidance departure was rarely a referendum on what the empath did or didn't do correctly. It was a reflection of an internal threshold that had nothing to do with the empath's worth, and everything to do with a nervous system still operating on defenses built long before this specific relationship ever began. The second thing worth understanding is why this specific empath's grief tends to last longer, in some ways, than grief following more obviously painful relationships. This seems counterintuitive at first. Shouldn't a relationship with real safety, real depth, real mutual recognition be easier to release than one built on chaos or mistreatment? But it actually works the opposite way, and the reason has to do with what the relationship proved rather than what it lacked. A painful, chaotic relationship, once it ends, at least confirms something the empath already suspected, that this wasn't right, that this wasn't safe, that leaving was necessary and correct. But this specific kind of relationship, the one where genuine depth and genuine attunement existed, where the avoidant genuinely showed real vulnerability, even if only in fragments, proves something much harder to release. That this kind of connection was actually possible for you. That you weren't asking for too much. That the safety you'd always wanted wasn't a fantasy. Because you experienced real moments of it, even if the whole didn't ultimately hold together. And once you know something is possible, once you've felt it directly, instead of just hoping for it abstractly, it becomes significantly harder to convince yourself to stop wanting it, even when the specific person who offered you a glimpse of it couldn't ultimately provide it consistently. This is where I want to offer a reframe that I think matters enormously for anyone sitting inside this exact kind of grief right now, because it's easy to spend years stuck in a story that doesn't actually serve your healing. The fact that this relationship proved real connection was possible for you doesn't mean it was only possible with that specific person. This is one of the cruelest tricks grief plays on us. It convinces us that because we found something rare with one particular person, that rarity was inherently tied to them specifically, rather than to the qualities you brought into the relationship. Qualities that remain entirely yours, entirely portable, entirely available to bring into future connections with people who are actually capable of receiving them fully, not just partially, not just in the moments when their nervous system allowed it. I also want to address something that tends to complicate this grief even further: the specific torment of watching an avoidant, after the relationship ends, sometimes reach back out, sometimes reappear months or even years later, sometimes express directly or indirectly that they never fully got over what was lost. This happens more often than people expect with this particular dynamic, precisely because of everything we discussed in the first half of this conversation. Because this empath became a reference point the avoidance nervous system genuinely can't erase. And I need to be very honest with you about what this reappearance actually means, and more importantly, what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean they're finally ready. It doesn't mean the years apart magically dismantled defenses that took a lifetime to construct. In many cases, it simply means enough time has passed that the original threat, the fear of real intimacy, real obligation, real vulnerability, has faded into a more comfortable, more manageable nostalgia, one that can be visited briefly, safely, without requiring the actual sustained closeness that originally triggered the retreat. This is an important distinction because so many empaths interpret this return as proof that if they just try again, this time will be different, when in reality, the same threshold that caused the original departure is often still fully intact, simply dormant, waiting to reactivate the moment real, sustained closeness is asked of them again. This brings me to something crucial about how this specific kind of empath eventually finds their way to peace, because peace here looks different than it does in relationships that ended through obvious mistreatment. Peace doesn't come from concluding the avoidant was a bad person, because that conclusion usually isn't accurate, and forcing yourself into it just to make the grief make sense tends to create its own kind of dishonesty that doesn't actually heal anything. Peace comes instead from a much more nuanced understanding that someone can be genuinely good, genuinely capable of real moments of connection, genuinely transformed, even briefly, by knowing you, and still not be someone capable, at this point in their own healing journey, of building the sustained life you actually need and deserve. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The relationship was real, the connection was real, and it still wasn't enough to build a life on. Not because you weren't enough, but because building a shared life requires two people operating from a baseline of security that wasn't fully available on their side, no matter how much presence they could offer in fragments. I think it's also worth naming something about what this experience teaches an empath about themselves, because even the most painful version of this story tends to leave behind something valuable if you're willing to actually look for it rather than only cataloging the loss. This relationship proves, in a way few other experiences can, that your specific way of loving, patient without being passive, present without being demanding, deeply attuned without requiring constant confirmation, is not a flaw to be corrected, is not evidence that you're settling for less than you deserve, is not proof that you're incapable of asking for what you need. It's actually a remarkable capacity, one that allowed someone deeply defended, deeply guarded, to experience real safety, however briefly, possibly for the first time in their entire adult life. The tragedy isn't that this capacity existed in you. The tragedy is that it met someone who couldn't yet meet it fully in return, and that mismatch in timing, in readiness, in internal security was never a referendum on your worth. It was simply two people, standing at very different points in their own healing, meeting each other with real depth, and discovering that depth alone isn't always sufficient to build something lasting, no matter how rare, how genuine, how quietly extraordinary that depth actually was. And so I want to close this conversation the way these conversations always seem to close, with a picture, because I think pictures land somewhere words alone sometimes can't quite reach. Picture the avoidant somewhere, in a quiet moment they'll never fully share with anyone, driving alone, lying awake, standing in a doorway of a life they've built since then, feeling a specific kind of ache pass through them that they still don't have full language for, a recognition that something rare passed through their life once, offered without demand, without pressure, without the fear they'd spent a lifetime bracing against, and that they, for reasons buried deep in a history that started long before you ever met them, weren't yet capable of holding on to it. That ache is real. It will likely never fully leave them. But it also isn't yours to carry, isn't yours to fix, isn't yours to wait around for, hoping enough time might finally transform it into the readiness it never quite reached, while you were still there to receive it. And picture yourself, too, in your own quiet moment, somewhere entirely separate from that story now, finally understanding something that took real time, real grief, real honest reflection to arrive at, that being unforgettable to someone was never actually the goal. Being fully met was always the goal. And those are not the same thing, no matter how much they can look alike from the outside, no matter how much a genuine, aching absence can masquerade as proof of a love that should have been enough to keep someone. You gave something real. It was received, even if imperfectly, even if only in fragments, even if the whole of what you offered was more than what could be held on to at the time. And now, standing outside that story, you get to carry forward the exact same capacity for depth, for patience, for genuine attunement, not as a wound waiting to be reopened by the next person who can't quite stay, but as a gift, fully intact, fully yours, waiting now for someone whose readiness finally matches the rare, quiet, extraordinary way you've always known how to love. Because that, in the end, is the real cinematic truth beneath everything we've walked through today. You were never the one who failed to be enough. You were simply the proof that enough was always possible. And proof like that doesn't disappear just because one person wasn't ready to build a life around it. It waits, patiently, exactly the way you always have, for the one who finally is.